Hello, and welcome to this Parkinson's webinar brought to you by Cure Parkinson's, the Journal of Parkinson's Disease, and the University of Edinburgh. I'm Professor Tilo Kunath at the Centre for Regenerative Medicine in Edinburgh, Scotland, and I'm pleased to be chairing today's session. So today we're going to be focusing on young onset Parkinson's disease, or YOPD. This is a type of Parkinson's that's often under-discussed. It raises some very important scientific, clinical, and personal questions. You'll hear genetics plays a larger role, and the timing of the diagnosis, as you can imagine, brings its own challenges. So today we'll take a deeper look into the biology and the genetics, also lived experience, research opportunities, and where the field can do better. I'm delighted to be joined by an excellent panel who I'll ask to introduce themselves briefly. So we will start with a set of pre-prepared questions for the first half an hour, and then we'll spend the second half addressing your questions. So please use the Q&A box to post your questions as we go along. Just to alert you, we won't be able to address individual clinical queries, but we will cover the broader issues. Some of the questions will be handled by Dr. Simon Stott, our Director of Research at Cure Parkinson's, in the chat. But let's begin with Vincenzo, please.
Thank you very much for the invitation to this exciting webinar. My name is Vincenzo Bonifati, and I'm a professor of genetics and movement disorders in the Erasmus University Medical Center in Rotterdam, Netherlands. I'm a doctor. I received my MD from University of Roma in Italy, where I also completed my residency in clinical neurology. I was there appointed as a staff neurology, and I spent about 10 years taking care of people with Parkinson's disease and other movement disorders there. But in the 2000s, I moved to the Erasmus University, where I received training in human molecular genetics and a PhD in 2003. And then I started to build my own group here, a lab. I was appointed associate professor, and then in 2012, full professor here. And I've been here ever since. My research focuses on understanding the molecular mechanisms of Parkinson's disease and trying to find new therapeutic targets by identifying genetic factors related to Parkinson's disease and characterizing the molecular pathways of these genetic factors. My work, the work of my lab led to the discovery of some genetic forms, hereditary forms of Parkinson's disease or Parkinsonism, and also other movement disorders such as dystonia and other disorders. I think combination of strong clinical molecular genetic expertise has been a key for me for my research endeavor. Thank you so much for having me.
Great. Thank you, Vincenzo. Sam in Bristol, please.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. I'm Sam Cole, and I have young onset Parkinson's myself. I have a genetic form. My dad also had YOPD, and I'm now the CEO of the UK charity that's Spotlight YOPD, that's led by and run for people with young onset Parkinson's. It's entirely volunteer run and patient-led. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sam. And last but not least, Connie in the University of Toronto.
Very good. Yes, thank you, and very happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I'm a neurologist in movement disorders and take care of patients with Parkinson's disease, and a professor of neurology at the University of Toronto. I grew up in Toronto, and so I've been here most of my life, but I did a fellowship training of 2 years in the United States in California, and spent some time traveling around the United States examining twin pairs where one of them had Parkinson's and one didn't, to try to understand more about why some people get Parkinson's and some people don't, mainly from the environmental point of view. Specifically with respect to young onset Parkinson's disease, though, I am a member of the Movement Disorder Society's study group on young onset Parkinson's disease. And I also have chaired the MDS Movement Disorder Society task force on Parkinson's subtypes, which is relevant to these questions that we'll be discussing. And most of my research is on epidemiology of Parkinson's disease, trying to understand patterns, environmental and genetic, and also understanding why some people with Parkinson's disease are so different from other people. and have a strong interest also in the lived experience of people with Parkinson's.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. The heterogeneity question is a big one. I'm going to start with you, Connie. I'm going to give you three questions to answer in turn. So first, let's define young onset PD. How does the progression differ from regular PD, and are there differences in symptoms?
Sure, yes. So the definition of young onset Parkinson's disease is, of course, an age threshold. And the most common definition is splitting people under and over the age of 50 as young onset versus not young onset Parkinson's disease. So this is a matter of debate, but it's generally around that age. Recently, a panel of experts of the early onset Parkinson's disease group of the Movement Disorder Society weighed various pros and cons and came up with 50 as a good definition based on how people's lives change around the age of 50, as well as how we feel that the characteristics of the disease are different between younger and older people, and 50 seems to be also a good age separation to see those differences. And with respect to those differences, Tilo, I think you want me to talk about how they look different, right? Yeah. So in younger onset Parkinson's disease is, as a group, can be characterized in a few different ways as distinct from later onset Parkinson's disease. But I will say it right at the outset that these are generalizations and everyone is different. Right? And so you may not fit in this mold personally. But if you look at larger groups of people with young onset Parkinson's disease, we'll see that people, generally speaking, have a slower progression of the condition than people with older onset Parkinson's disease. That people tend to have a higher risk for motor fluctuations and dyskinesias. So those ups and downs that people experience throughout the daily medication related cycle in the day of somebody with Parkinson's disease, particularly as Parkinson's disease advances, and dyskinesias, the involuntary movements that we associate with as an effect of levodopa, are more common in people with young onset Parkinson's disease. On the bright side, again, they're less likely to have gait walking disturbance and balance disturbance, and less likely to have cognitive dysfunction than people with older onset Parkinson's disease. Depression, however, is a more common feature in people with young onset Parkinson's disease, and may not only be due to the biology of the disease itself, but also the weight of trying to balance being in the time of life when you're also dealing with career and family and many other obligations that can really be difficult to manage in the context of a chronic disease. And not only that, but in the context of those responsibilities, dealing with stigma of the disease, which has been shown to be a significant also issue for people with younger onset more than older onset Parkinson's. So those are the things that I would highlight, but there are a number of other differences as well.
That was very clear. Thank you, Connie. Sam, can I ask you what are some of the challenges people with young onset Parkinson's face, and if you're willing to share some of your own personal experiences?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, as Connie's touched on some of them, I think younger people are more likely to experience delays or misattribution along the way towards their diagnosis, and often feel that they need to become quite expert as self-advocates and find out an awful lot themselves. But generally, it's about the stage of life. I think that's where most of the challenges come from, as Connie indicated. People are often of working age, career, it's the peak sort of career building, earning years. For some, they may have been planning to come back into the workplace, having started a family. And it's yeah, there's often a lot of people have spoken to us quite a bit about delaying disclosure at work for fear of stigma or fear about whether they'll be treated differently or undermine their own prospects at work. And so they miss accommodations and tend to burn out earlier. Seems to be a pattern that we hear about. And just even if you do disclose at work, I think a lack of understanding about how it might impact you as a younger person. And of course, that contributes to the sort of the chronic financial precarity that comes with a long-term health condition anyway. So you've got the reduced lifetime earnings, but at the same time that you've probably still got long-term financial commitments, mortgages, that kind of thing, and higher cumulative out-of-pocket medical costs. It's quite expensive in my experience getting young onset Parkinson's, especially if you want to do lots of the things that are very, that are supposed to be good for us and supportive of our health. All the exercise costs money. And I guess the main other thing is that people are often in at least one bit of a sandwich with perhaps older parents still alive who may not be in the best health themselves, or and children of their own, or they might be at a point in their life where they're planning a family. So the genetics in that context becomes very important, I think, for younger people, thinking about impact it might have on siblings, but also children that they may have now or that they may have hoped to have. And yeah, I think the sort of the risk of double social isolation, really, we don't tend to fit into typical spaces for people with Parkinson's, but age peer spaces aren't always the most appropriate either. So in my own experience, I think I've seen that most in the area of sort of health and fitness, that if I go along to classes that are specific for people with Parkinson's, they're often a little bit too easy for me. I'm often surrounded by people with quite a lot more advanced motor dysfunction than me, maybe cognitive impairment as well. And I can often end up feeling like I get recruited as a bit of a additional facilitator of the class, helping people not trip over chairs and that kind of thing. But if I go to a regular Pilates class, that's likely to be potentially embarrassing for me when I try and stand up from a lying down pose and fall over. So I think it's just navigating all of those kind of things really on top of a health condition. And I guess another thing from my perspective as a woman is that we really don't know very much about the impact on sort of fertility, reproduction, hormones, perimenopause, that kind of thing. So a lot of the symptoms that I experience with my Parkinson's potentially could also be perimenopausal symptoms. So it's quite hard. There's a lot of overlap: temperature regulation, sleep disruption, those kinds of things. But I think Connie might be able to speak a little more to that.
Oh, Connie, yeah, please.
Yes, sure. So the hormonal influences on Parkinson's disease have been a subject of a lot of inquiry, mostly with respect to how the symptoms can fluctuate with respect to hormonal cycles in women with young onset Parkinson's disease. And although much of this is fairly small groups of people studied, it's quite consistent that when there are symptom fluctuations, it's usually in the premenstrual period that Parkinson's symptoms worsen. And sometimes this can be overcome with increasing medication, or even there's cases of special DBS, deep brain stimulation settings for that period that then change when somebody passes that week of the premenstrual phase. There was one survey of about 200 people that found that this is really very common, that symptoms worsen, and sometimes with requirement of extra medication during the premenstrual phase. So, yeah.
Thank you, Connie. Okay, we're going to move to our genetics expert, Vincenzo. If you could briefly describe what genes are, and then the genetic risk factors most commonly associated with YOPD.
Yeah, sure. The definition of a gene, although it's in common use in the lay persons nowadays, is that it's a unit, a functional unit in our DNA, in our genetic material, in our cells, that is responsible for the expression of one hereditary trait or one hereditary feature of our body, of our cells. More specifically, is a sequence of DNA that produces the message to encode to make one protein in our body, or sometimes another molecule that is called RNA, but that's a little bit more technical. So it's more simply to think it's responsible. A gene is responsible for encoding for one feature that is inherited from our parents. So in early onset diseases in general, the role of genes is more important. So the earlier is the onset of any disease, the higher is the likelihood that a genetic factor is involved in the origin of the disease. That's not only true for Parkinson, but in general. And in Parkinson's disease, a lot of efforts have gone into the identification of genetic factors responsible or, let's say, modulating the risk to develop disease as a way to understand the disease mechanisms, right? In order to understand the disease mechanisms, in order to make a better diagnosis, in order to also find subjects who have the same genetic origin that are very important for clinical trials that are targeting a specific genetic form of the disease. But I should first clarify that genetic factors can be very different in their strength, in their energy, in their effect size, we say in genetics. So we go from very mild genetic factors, which are usually modulating the risk of a disease for a very tiny fraction. Let's say if I have a lifetime risk of PD, it's let's say 2%. If I have one of these very small genetic factors, my risk goes from 2% to 2.1%. So it's really very, very small modification. But there could be many of those tiny genetic factors. So I could have 100 of these genetic factors. If I have all of these 100 genetic very mild factors, my risk might be substantially increased for the disease. And then we have a whole range of size effects. You have genetic factors that modulate the risk from 2% to 10%, or the strongest ones that are the ones that are responsible for hereditary forms of disease, let's say modulate the risk from 2% to 50% or to 80% or to 100% in the worst case. So we have an entire range of potency of these genetic factors. Speaking about the strongest of these genetic factors, which are perhaps more of direct medical relevance because they can really be seen as a cause, although they are very rare in general. In young onset PD patients, we have identified in the last 20 years about 20 genes, each of them being able to cause an early onset, a young onset form of PD or atypical PD, we call Parkinsonism, and each of them has a clinical specific phenotype, a different form of presentation and progression. So they can be very different from each other. But the three most common genes that can be a cause in patients with young onset are called PARK2 or Parkin, PINK1 or PARK6, and DJ1 or PARK7. So PARK2, PARK6, and PARK7 are numerically the most frequent in patients with a young onset. And they are especially frequent in the juvenile PD forms, meaning people who have onset before age of 20, and also those who have onset before age of 30. People who have onset after age of 30, the frequency of those genes is already much lower. But there is still a chance also in people who have onset of symptoms at age 40 or 50 or sometimes even 60, sometimes rarely genetic cause is identified in those genes. So those are the three most common, but there are, as I said, another 15 at least, and the impression is that there will be many more still remaining to be identified, but each of them will be very rare, unfortunately, because it's much more difficult to find them.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so yeah, Parkin, PINK1, and DJ1 is genes I hear about a lot. Sam, if you have young onset PD, should you go for genetic testing?
Well, I don't think there's any should about it. It's obviously a very individual decision, but I think perhaps framing it in terms of what decisions would actually change if you had that information is quite a useful way to approach it. And I suppose it's worth considering that it's very often not an a sort of journey that impacts just one individual. So it can have implications, obviously, for your parents if they're still alive, and the sort of carrier guilt around that can come up for people, but also siblings if you have them, and any children, of course, or any children that you're perhaps planning to have, which is one reason to consider the genetic testing. I guess others is access to trials, that kind of thing. So those influenced my decision to get testing. I'm also just the kind of person that always wants to know everything I possibly can. But my sibling, for example, decided not to get tested, even though that was offered to them. And their reasoning was really just that it wouldn't change anything. It would perhaps just make them even more anxious. They've already got a sibling and a parent with Parkinson's. You know, they know to look out for it. They know they may be at some risk. They wouldn't do anything differently, so they decided not to find out. And we were offered, my partner, to get testing to see if he had any carrier genes that might raise the risk for our son, but he's 8, so we decided at the moment that there wasn't much point us having that information when we'd wait and let him make the decision whether he wants that information for himself when he's older. But it's quite a few things to weigh up, I think, in making that decision.
Yeah, thank you. Vincenzo, what's your view on genetic testing for individuals?
Well, this is a big question, and we could discuss this for hours actually. In short, I would like to see this problem as which are the pros and the cons of genetic testing. So the pros, I think, are that you can reach in at least a few patients an etiological diagnosis, so you can be sure of what was the cause of the disease, and this can be relieving anxiety in people about the origin of their disease. I mean, if I would have PD, I think I would like to know why I got it personally, and then genetic can be one answer, although not in the majority of patients so far. And I think it's part of the medical mission to find the cause of a disease. It's also part of the medical mission in general, but of course the decision remains with the subject. And finding that gene is a cause of disease can be particularly beneficial in the early stage of a disease. So from the beginning you avoid the long diagnostic journeys to find the cause. You avoid the complicated diagnostic procedures when you don't know what is the cause, and you look for exotic or odd kind of diseases. It can be also important in difficult or atypical clinical presentations where it looks like not to be PD, because sometimes the juvenile forms are really presenting in a way that is not typical. So those could benefit from genetic testing. And as I said, it avoids many other additional invasive or expensive diagnostic instrumental examinations. The cons are also there, though. The screening is complex, and especially with the modern technology, you get a lot of results in many genes, and sometimes it's very difficult to interpret these results and to be sure whether a certain genetic factor found in a certain gene is really the cause of the disease or is just a chance finding. So that's a problem. Also, you can get nowadays, when you look at all the genes in the genome, you can find a genetic variant in another gene that is a cause well known of another disease. So I do genetic testing for my Parkinson, and I found out that I have a gene that causes an heart attack or causes a cancer. So that's what we call incidental or secondary findings, but can be not at all secondary for individuals. So this additional challenge that is now posed by this complicated and very widespread genetic analysis now available. Another problem, another complication is that a negative result of a genetic testing does not exclude that there are mutations in genes. because we might not be able to see some mutations, some genetic factors yet. So when I receive a result, it's not negative, but it's inconclusive in a way, right? In most cases, it should be seen as inconclusive. So that's can be another source of even more anxiety for the person. And last but not least, so far, even if I find that I have a mutation in a gene that definitely has been the cause of my disease, I cannot do much or anything to change my disease progression or prevent the disease. So far, this might change. I really hope that this will change very soon. But at the moment, the answer is still that I cannot do anything to change the disease or prevent it. So that's actually a main reason, main argument for the people who say why I should get genetic testing. I cannot do much about it. But as we already alluded to, a new advantage of genetic testing is that if I'm found to carry a certain gene as a cause of my PD, I'm eligible to participate in clinical trials that are directly, specifically at the people who carry that genetic form. And this is a big change in the research arena nowadays. So that's an extra reason why, in my view, genetic testing should be performed.
Great, thank you. Complicated and thorny issue. Connie, can I ask you about clinical trials? So people with YOPD are sometimes excluded or sometimes are not participating much in clinical trials. What's your perspective on this?
Well, I think that there are a number of contributors to that issue. With respect to not participating in clinical trials, even if somebody is eligible for a clinical trial, I think that can often speak to the fact that there are people with young onset Parkinson's disease are often working, they have families, they have burdens that make it difficult to spend the time and travel to the center, and so it's not easy to participate in a clinical trial, especially when you have other commitments. From the point of view of eligibility for clinical trials, it's often that clinical trials have a younger age limit for participation. It's not always the case, but sometimes it's the case because of the fact that we try when somebody's testing a new therapy or a new experimental drug, that you want a group of people that is relatively similar, that isn't, don't have, unusual genetic factors that may make the disease perform differently, or you don't know if the condition is going to apply to that kind of Parkinson's disease. And so that may be the case for some experimental therapeutic trials. And also by virtue of the very fact that Parkinson's disease in young onset tends to progress more slowly, which is a great thing, it does make it more challenging in clinical trials for them to see whether or not a new experimental drug is going to change the progression of the disease, because you'd have to follow somebody with young onset Parkinson's much longer in order to see that effect, right? So it's some practicalities and others are sort of logistical issues.
Thank you, Connie. Sam, what are your thoughts on lack of participation or challenges for young onset PD to participate in clinical trials?
Yeah, thanks, Tilo. I think Connie's mentioned a lot of them. Some of them are quite practical. Even a trial recently that was I was potentially recruited for, that was saying, it's very little involvement, meant train to the city a whole day without medication, lots of testing, and when you've got to take a day off work and you won't miss your child going to bed, that's quite a big ask. And I think even I do get involved in as much research as I can, but I think often researchers might underestimate the emotional impact of being involved in those studies as well. So even quite a light one that I've been able to do from home, online, is an hour of filling out questionnaires about what I can't do and how I might get worse in the future. And, do I feel like my life is worth living, and those kind of things. And and then I've got to go back to a work meeting or pick up my child. So sometimes I think, why am I feeling a little bit flat today? And it's because I've been in Parkinson's world's a little bit too much. So I think that might be a factor. But it is interesting that we hear a lot from people who are very, very motivated at Spotlight, that really want to get involved in research, really want to contribute, really want to influence it and get involved. So there's a bit of a mismatch happening somewhere sometimes, I think, where people seem to tell us as well that they find it hard to recruit people with YOPD. And yeah, I know there's a lot of enthusiasm out there in the community from some.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that mismatch is real, and I think this is something that we really need to address. Let's see if we can talk about some concrete research opportunities. I have some prepared in the UK, but maybe Connie, do you want to sort of talk to this, even some registries that you know of?
Yes, yeah, maybe it's most practical from my side to talk about the registries that I know that can help connect people to research opportunities. So there are research trial finding services, and one of them is the Fox Trial Finder, which you can sign up to and describe yourself, and then that's sponsored by the Michael J. Fox Foundation, and they can connect you with particular research opportunities that may match your profile. So that's and that may be more applicable to people in North America, but there may be also similar resources in other parts of the world that I'm not aware of. For people that are not interested in interventional studies, but are really interested in participating in observational studies, the Parkinson Progression Markers Initiative is an enormous study that's also sponsored by the Michael J. Fox Foundation that has made a huge difference to our understanding of Parkinson's, including its underlying biology. So that's another one that is ongoing and still recruiting. Yeah, those couple that I might highlight.
Yeah, thank you, Connie. For the UK, I think a really exciting trial that people from age 30 upwards can register interest in is in the Accelerating Clinical Trials for Parkinson's, or ACT-PD. So this is just launching. So in the UK, I think this is a great place to register your interest if you can Google ACT-PD. But another really UK-centric one that I think that would be of interest that is taking people from age 18 to 90 is an initiative called PD Frontline, where you can put in your information and then you get genetic testing done. So one of the questions that is coming up on the Q&A is about genetic testing, but part of the PD Frontline is that you submit a saliva sample, and then they will do genetic testing for a selected number of genes, so not all the thorough gene testing, as Vincenzo was alluding to, but there are a number of opportunities in the UK. Vincenzo, do you have any comments on research opportunities, either internationally, in Europe, etc.?
Well, what I can add is what I think it's important that as many people with Parkinson get genetic testing as possible, because they will help identifying these additional missing genes that we still look for, particularly the juvenile PD or early onset PD patients will be very important for this endeavor, because every new gene that we identify can open a new window into the disease mechanism, which can be applicable to PD in general, not only to this rare form of genetic forms of Parkinson's disease. That's why a single individual with Parkinson's disease can be extremely important to help all patients with the disease. So I really encourage participation in all these registries, particularly those that also involve genetic testing, which is another challenge. As we already said, the patient has to receive a lot of information about the pros and cons of genetic testing, and after this information is discussed, the subject has to make the decision whether they want to receive genetic testing or not. So it's an extra phase in the study, which is very important, has to be handled professionally by genetic counselors or psychologists or neurologists, or preferably a team involving all those three professionals, as it is, for example, in the Netherlands. But I know that in other countries it's differently handled. In other countries, genetic information is more directly handled by neurologists. But there must be a phase where this is discussed with the individual before the consent is given for genetic testing. But I strongly encourage that is done.
Thank you. So we're going to get to the questions in a moment, but I'm going to ask Sam one last question about what can we as a community do better for the young onset, as a research community, do better for young people with young onset Parkinson's.
Oh, that's very nice of you to ask. I think involve us as early as you can, from concepts to right the way through the research, and with genuine co-production and collaboration, rather than just, kind of a tick box exercise. And there are some brilliant research teams that I'm aware of that are doing a great job at that, and I'm very lucky to be on the patient council of one in particular. And it really does make a difference to see how our input throughout is actually making sure that what they're trying to produce will actually answer some of the questions that matter to us, not just clinical questions that, so what? It's interesting for someone in a lab, but it's not particularly interesting to us or that significant for us. So I think I'd encourage people who are able to, with young onset Parkinson's, to find those opportunities to influence research and get into that dialogue. Just keep asking us. We are out here somewhere.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Co-production and co-design of clinical trials is key. So I'm going to ask a few of the questions coming in. So maybe, Connie, I'll ask you this one first. If DNA or familial risk of developing PD are identified, are there any lifestyle or dietary advice that you could do? Anything you can do to reduce or slow the progression?
Oh, yes.
A common thought of many people.
Yeah, that's so important. So one of the two things that I tell people about this are, one is exercise. Exercise is probably at this point the one disease modifying thing that we can all do, and we have yet to discover or establish disease modifying therapies for Parkinson's disease, although exercise seems to have disease modifying properties. And by that, I mean it can slow the progression of the disease, right? And so if you're at risk, it makes sense to think that it can also delay onset of Parkinson's disease. And, best case, it may not prevent it altogether, but I would say that. And various forms of exercise have been shown to be beneficial. It seems that, resistance, cardiovascular exercise, stretching, all, balance exercises, all relevant. The second thing, dietary, that's a little less well defined. Probably the Mediterranean diet, in quotation marks, is a dietary pattern that seems to be associated with lower risk of Parkinson's disease. It's unknown whether or not, it's never been studied if that can actually forestall the onset of Parkinson's disease, but because it has a number of health benefits anyway, it would make sense to adopt it. So, a diet of fresh vegetables, fish, that kind of component. And I'm not a dietary expert, but that too, to name all of its components, but that would be something that would be very reasonable to do.
Yeah, all very sensible. Yeah, exercise seems to be a huge beneficial factor for many people with PD. So Dawn from Spotlight YOPD, maybe this question's for Vincenzo. So, people are often diagnosed quite, it's a long process. It could be years before the diagnosis, and diagnosis at 51 or 52, even though they've had Parkinson's for maybe 8 or 10 years, are they still considered a young onset Parkinson's with the strict definition of 50 that Connie was giving us?
Yeah, I mean, if I understand correctly the question, there is a long phase of the disease, especially at the first few years, that is not featuring motor problems, but non-motor problems. And those are not recognized as part of Parkinson's still by many persons, even by many doctors. Actually, the motor part, the Parkinsonism itself, is not the beginning, not the first phase of clinical disease. It's later. Many patients have other symptoms before they experience the first tremor or the first slowness of movements that brings them to the doctor or to the neurologist. That's why it takes a few years, perhaps, to first of all realize that something is not okay with the person, and then takes a few more years. Many times the person with Parkinson at the beginning is considered to have rheumatological problems, stiffness of the joints, and is sent to rheumatologists, physical therapists, physical doctors, physical medical doctors. And then finally, the idea that this is a neurological brain disease comes. So that's still a problem in delaying the diagnosis, but there is much more awareness nowadays compared to already, let's say, 10 or 20 years ago, when this was really a huge problem. But still, particularly also in peripheral places, small villages, still there are ideas like this is something related to the age of the people. It's not a disease, it's just a slowness, and people are considered just having elderly signs, but that doesn't apply to the young onset, of course, people. But it is still part of the problem. In my experience, I found sometimes relatives in families which we are studying who were never diagnosed. They were clearly Parkinsonian, and they were considered as being like this all their life, or not considered as being sick, and they were receiving treatment, having a lot of benefit still. Also, in some cases, even early onset persons with PD.
Yeah, thank you. I think the date of diagnosis and when Parkinson's actually started can be very, very different. We're getting a lot of questions about how do you get genetic testing in the UK. So PD Frontline, someone mentioned, is really only testing for GBA1 and LRRK2. I know in Scotland, genetic testing can be done through Dundee. But if I can ask Sam, who's living in England, where can you get genetic testing for YOPD in England?
I can't speak with any great authority about that. I only know from my own experience. I think it's definitely not routinely offered to everybody. In my case, it was offered because I was still at an age and point in my life where we were thinking about having more children potentially. So it was offered for that reason. But I think especially with YOPD, where at the moment there isn't any differentiation of treatment based on that information, is not an automatic thing. But Caitlin might, I don't know if they're able to speak more to that than I would be able to, or to put that in the Q&A. But yeah, it's definitely not a standard thing. I think most people I know have managed to find out by getting involved in trials, and getting involved in research and doing it that way.
That's a good point. I think getting involved in trials opens up the possibility to get genetic testing. Connie, can I ask you this question? I'm very interested in the links between YOPD and motivational issues, attention problems, addiction. Do you have any insights between these connections, if there is connections?
Yeah. So I don't have an insight into why they happen. You can say it has been shown in various studies that people with young onset Parkinson's disease have a higher predisposition to impulsive compulsive behaviors related to dopaminergic treatment. So the treatments that can, hypersexuality, gambling, shopping, eating, compulsions. But we don't know why that is. So I can't provide specific insights there. I'm afraid I don't have any other thoughts to offer. Important questions, though. It's an important question.
Absolutely, yeah. This one you touched on previously. So someone wanted to know a bit more about the link between dementia progression or dementia risk with YOPD, and I think you did say it was lower, but can you be a bit more specific with numbers potentially?
Oh, my goodness. Well, again, I think numbers is a bit tricky. And I will say that there are forms of young onset Parkinson's disease where the risk can be higher, right? And other forms of young onset Parkinson's disease, where we know that it's lower. If you put everybody in a basket, it's lower than in later onset Parkinson's disease. And but I can't give you sort of a lifetime risk. And again, I would say that that's probably a dangerous thing to do, because we know that forms like of certain genetic forms like synuclein gene variants, GBA variants may have a higher risk, and those can happen in young onset Parkinson's disease. So, and maybe Vincenzo could comment on a little bit on that heterogeneity.
Thank you. Yeah, I was going to ask Vincenzo next, because I think Parkin, DJ1, and PINK1 are, I think, well known not to have Lewy bodies, maybe, and then Lewy bodies then are not present in the brain, and then they don't get dementia. Vincenzo, is that correct? What's your opinion?
Yeah, I would say that for Parkin and PINK1 there is more evidence because several brains have been studied post-mortem, and yeah, the answer is that there are no Lewy bodies, but that's only. So it's not only that, is that the neuronal loss is much more confined to some specific areas on the brain in those people. So the disease is really different in terms of which are the neurons that die in this brain. So there's much fewer neurons than in the PD, where there are no mutations in these two genes, Parkin and PINK. So I think many of us consider Parkin and PINK something separate, which is better, is more benign than the ones that don't have those two genes. The DJ1 is different. DJ1 is a gene that is more rare than Parkin and PINK, but is worse in terms of clinical presentation and progression, because it's much more similar to the standard form of Parkinson. DJ1 patients develop dementia, can develop dystonia, and develop psychiatric problems. So it's really much closer to PD than Parkin and PINK. And not surprisingly, in DJ1 patients, although only 2 brains are studied so far, there are a lot of Lewy bodies. So DJ1 is a Lewy body disease. It's really positive for Lewy bodies, and perhaps even more than the idiopathic PD form. So it's really a synuclein positive form of PD. Which doesn't, surprise in terms of clinical presentation and progression. It's much worse than Parkin and PINK, but fortunately more uncommon. And then there are many other forms, again, genetic forms of PD, much more rare. Most of them do not have the Lewy bodies, but some also have. So there are other rare forms of genetic Parkinsonism. They're often atypical, not really quite typical, but they do have also a severe load of synuclein pathology in the brain, and we think that those can be very helpful for us to understand the disease mechanisms.
Great, thank you. Before I get to the next question, Simon Stott from Cure Parkinson's has put in the chat that genetic testing in the UK can be done through the Parkinson's Family Project at UCL. In London, and a link will be sent out to all the participants that are present, but all the registered participants. Maybe this question is for Connie about non-motor symptoms. How common are things like constipation, loss of sense of smell, for example, with young onset PD?
Mm-hmm. So non-motor symptoms are common in young onset Parkinson's disease, particularly when you think about mood-related symptoms, depression, again, motivation. But when we start talking about olfaction, though, it's probably a little bit more common to have preserved olfaction, preserved sense of smell in young onset Parkinson's disease. This may probably have to do with underlying genetic determinants, entities that are less associated with olfactory disturbance. And sorry, by olfactory I mean sense of smell. And constipation, though, is a common early feature in both young and older onset Parkinson's disease. So it shares many of the non-motor features of older onset Parkinson's disease, aside from those that we've mentioned.
Yeah. And we have 2 questions about why is YOPD slower progressing Is there any underlying understanding of why it's slower than regular or typical Parkinson's?
Yeah, so I think there's probably two major factors related to that, and then probably a lot of others we don't understand. One of them, Vincenzo has talked about already in terms of the specific genetic forms that that are somewhat different from pathologically in the brain from regular Parkinson's disease that make them almost different entities. But aside from that, younger people have a lot more resilience, and we can, in Parkinson's disease, as we age, there are we're more vulnerable to having the symptoms of Parkinson's disease come to the surface and progress faster, and we lack the ability to compensate for the degenerative process. So I think a lot of it is the combination of aging and Parkinson's disease. For young onset Parkinson's, you have aging on your side, right? You're young, you have the ability to resist, and things like exercise and diet can bolster those protective mechanisms.
Great, thank you. Question for Sam. I'm not sure you'll be able to answer this, but I'll read it. Is there any advice or research for those with neurodiversity, such as Asperger's and early onset Parkinson's, especially someone who prefers to be behind a computer than going out? Tough question.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, one to which I do not have an answer. No, we've often had questions come through to the charity for people who are trying to explain their own diagnosis to children, perhaps who have neurodiversity, and what's a good way to explain it to them. But no, I don't know about the overlap there. I don't know if anyone else is any the wiser.
Any comments from Connie or Vincenzo?
It's perhaps just a hopeful comment that more and more research opportunities are available remotely, virtually, right? And so to feel that you can, if you're motivated in that regard, to contribute to research, it's very helpful to know that there are research opportunities out there that don't involve going out, if that's a barrier to you. Here in Canada, we also have a very robust telehealth system, so that if it's a barrier for you accessing care, then finding a doctor who will see people remotely can be a way to access care, where you might otherwise be isolated.
Yeah, I'm going to ask an interesting question that I know someone in Edinburgh is interested in about red light therapy, and is it useful for YOPD? So this is, I guess, infrared light that is thought to activate mitochondria. Does anyone have a comment about red light therapy? There's a lot of no. Okay, I think I'll move to the next one. Is about tremor dominant. So someone has been described as tremor dominant by the physician. Is this a classic sign of young onset PD, and what does this implications for individuals that are tremor dominant, which are many individuals? Maybe Connie.
Sure. Yes, it's a very common subtype, if you will, of young onset Parkinson's disease, more common than for later onset Parkinson's disease, and has the accompanying characteristics of slower progression in general. Pathologically, it's not different than other than typical Parkinson's disease, so it's not, it's certainly well within the classical Parkinson's disease phenotype or subtype. Yes. So.
Yeah, I've been sort of told that tremor dominant is also normally more slower progressing. This is an interesting question. What opportunities are there for research for siblings of people with young onset PD. Vincenzo, and then Sam.
I would say yes, they are definitely of interest for geneticists because they might be carrying the mutation that is causing disease in the affected SIB, and those carriers are nowadays extremely useful for research because they have. If they carry the same mutation, and we know that that mutation has been the cause in the SIB, we can study those asymptomatic, non-manifesting carriers. And this is very crucial nowadays because we really look for those symptomatic carriers to test novel methods, novel strategies for disease prevention. So that you have really a wonderful opportunity. So they can be very helpful for these reasons.
Yeah, I think I've seen papers where the asymptomatic carrier are often in the paper, so there would be a sibling of a carrier, I guess. Sam, what are your thoughts?
Siblings or parents, also parents sometimes are.
Sam, what are your thoughts on siblings getting involved in research? I think you mentioned a brother who wasn't interested.
Yeah, I've got a sibling who's not interested, so I don't think I'd be able to persuade them. But I've certainly been involved in research myself where um, siblings have been able to participate if they'd wanted to. So, and I think it's a fantastic opportunity for anyone that is interested in doing it, with just the same caveats I said before, really, just bearing in mind that it can be a bit of a slog sometimes, but it's, if you keep focused on the point of being involved and the potential gain from engaging in the research, it might get you through. It's a very nice thing for a sibling to do.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe this was for Connie. Can people who have lost their sense of smell get it back?
I've never heard of such a phenomenon. No, it's a permanent effect once it occurs.
Okay, I think that was a clear answer. One more question about the gut. So I think you mentioned young onset PD also have gut problems, but there's a specific question about what is the connection between the gut and PD and young onset PD, and is there any probiotics or any sort of things you would recommend to help the gut issues, and would that improve the PD, the Parkinson's symptoms?
I see. So, for those less familiar, there is a strong connection between between Parkinson's disease and the gut, particularly the colon, where we can see the abnormal protein accumulations in the gut wall, and this generally manifests most prominently as constipation in people with Parkinson's. And there's even a hypothesis that perhaps whatever triggers Parkinson's disease can enter via the gut and then cause the pathology to progress finally to the brain and the rest of the nervous system. So I don't believe that there is a distinction between this connection in younger onset versus older onset Parkinson's disease. I believe that the mechanisms are thought to be the same, but are still incompletely understood. As to what you can do, the probiotics are thought to be likely beneficial in terms of helping to restore the regular colonies of bacteria that we have in our gut and helping to improve that. Control of constipation is crucial for helping to promote the uptake and the action of medications for Parkinson's disease. And so probiotics are good, but also fiber in the diet and other dietary factors, many of them that can help control that are very important. They can help many of the symptoms of Parkinson's disease, with no evidence, though, that it alters the underlying progression of the condition at this point.
Great. Thank you, Connie. That was really clear. I'm going to try to summarize what everyone's been saying in the last couple of minutes. So Connie started us off by defining young onset PD as diagnosed at age of 50, or younger. But as we've already discussed, when someone has Parkinson's and gets the official diagnosis can be quite different. So this is, I think, something that we really need to consider. So there's some things about young onset PD that are different in regular PD. So the progression is normally slower. There's a less chance of progression to dementia. They usually don't lose their sense of smell, but they often have things like constipation. And they may be more likely to have depression, but very less likely to have dementia. I think Sam was really clear with the different challenges with young onset Parkinson's. You know, you're usually working, have a young family, and the stigma associated with that. And even the story about the exercise classes was really, really telling, I think. You know, you don't quite fit into the regular Parkinson's class, but the high intensity Pilates class may not be for you either. So it is really, really challenging. It's expensive. So although in Canada and in the UK we have the NHS and free healthcare, but it is expensive because there's all these other things that can be done that do cost money. From Vincenzo, we hear about the genetics. The younger you are, the more chance that you have a genetic cause of the condition. Is it worth getting tested or not? It's a very personal decision. There is genetic testing done in the UK, and there will be a link sent out for people to do that. The last point is get involved in research when and where you can. I think you're just going to get a lot more care and a lot more opportunities to help the community and even to guide research. So this co-creation of clinical trials is really important. We need to involve people with Parkinson's. So please take that to heart. Join me in thanking Connie, Vincenzo, and Sam, and we'll see you next time. Thanks very much.